72 hours. That's how long you've got. My sister said, reaching for the salt like she hadn't just detonated something at the centre of the table. Her tone was so casual it almost sounded like she was offering me a weather update. I was halfway through cutting a piece of roasted chicken when the words registered. My knife paused mid-air, hovering above the plate. The sound of forks tapping on porcelain didn't stop. No one gasped. No one looked at me. My mum kept chewing her food methodically, like always. My dad reached for the wine bottle and topped off his glass like it was any other Thursday night. And me, I sat there trying to decide if I'd heard her wrong. I hadn't. Marianne didn't even look up. She just added a pinch of salt to her plate and started talking about an upcoming school fundraiser, something about her oldest daughter playing violin. It was as if she hadn't just handed me a deadline, as if this wasn't her way of cleaning out the last person in the house who still remembered what it felt like when Grandpa was alive, when the home felt like a home, not a silent negotiation. I looked at my mum. She always avoided eye contact when uncomfortable, and tonight was no exception. Her eyes focused on the mashed potatoes like she was dissecting them. My dad, he looked tired, not angry, not guilty, just tired, and that made it worse. His silence wasn't shock, it was consent. The thing about getting blindsided is you still have to finish your meal with the people who hit you. You don't get to push back your chair and storm out. You don't get to yell, not in this family. You swallow what's in front of you, even if it's betrayal, even if it tastes like metal. I kept chewing, not because I wasn't furious, but because I knew better than to show it. That was the rule here. If something broke, you cleaned it quietly. If someone hurt you, you smiled through dessert. I had learned that the hard way when I was 14 and came home crying after being shoved at school, and my father told me to walk it off. Marianne had patted my head like a pet and asked if I'd done something to provoke it. That's when I realised silence wasn't just survival here, it was currency. 72 hours. Marianne had given me a countdown, not a conversation, not a compromise. Just a deadline, like I was an invoice she was tired of seeing. I wanted to ask her when she became so good at looking me in the eye while twisting the knife. I wanted to ask Mum if she even remembered what Grandpa wrote in that letter the day I graduated. The one he tucked into a card and left on my old desk, saying, "One day, this place will need you more than it needs anyone else." I wanted to remind them all that I came back here because they said it was just until you get back on your feet. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but no one looked at me. No one asked why I wasn't talking. They just kept eating. I could hear the clink of Marianne's bracelet as she cut her steak, the gentle hum of the dishwasher in the background, the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath Dad's chair as he shifted his weight. It was like a scene from one of those calm, well-lit family commercials. Except I was invisible in it. My appetite disappeared, but I kept my hand steady, cutting through chicken like it was paper. I figured the only thing worse than being asked to leave your own grandfather's house was reacting in a way that gave them permission to say, "See, she's always emotional." Instead, I said nothing. I nodded slightly like she'd told me the weather forecast. Then I took another bite. I let the silence wrap around my shoulders like a too-tight coat. And they let me. Of course they did. The thing is, I wasn't shocked by Marianne. Not really. She'd always had this way of rearranging things in her favour closets, conversations, wills. But I wasn't ready for the way Mum didn't flinch, for the way Dad couldn't even pretend to be surprised. By the time dessert came out, some kind of lemon tart, Marianne probably didn't bake herself. My heart wasn't even beating fast anymore. It was just resigned. a quiet thump, the kind you feel in your throat when you're trying hard not to cry. I looked down at my plate. The edge of the ceramic was chipped. Same chip it had since I was a kid. I used to run my finger over it, pretending it was a little cliff. I did it now out of habit. Only this time, my mind wasn't on the chip. It was on the safe, the old one in Grandpa's study, hidden behind the bookshelf with the loose hinge. He used to let me open it when I was little, taught me how to turn the dial with patience, how the lock would always click twice before it gave in. He never said what was inside, only that some truths can't live out in the open. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake in the guest room, the one Marianne called temporary quarters, staring at the ceiling and hearing those words. And the click of that safe, that sound, that click. Maybe he left me something, maybe not. But suddenly I needed to know. The next morning I didn't go downstairs. I waited until I heard the front door close, Dad heading out for his morning walk, probably pretending he wasn't avoiding me. I crept down the hallway barefoot, careful not to wake Mom or Marianne. The wood still creaked, in the same places it had 20 years ago. That familiarity stung more than I expected. I stood outside my old bedroom for a moment before pushing the door open. The room hadn't changed much, but it didn't belong to me anymore. The posters were gone, the books rearranged, the desk repurposed as a sewing table. My name had been erased gently, like someone was trying not to make a fuss. I stepped inside anyway. The air smelled faintly like lavender and dust. A few of my old things were still there, tucked away, like forgotten props from a play no one wanted to stage again. On the shelf, I found the snow globe Grandpa gave me when I was 10. Inside, a miniature cabin sat surrounded by pine trees, frozen in its own tiny blizzard. I shook it, once watched the flakes fall, and thought about how long it had been since anyone had touched it. The bedspread was new. The pillowcases weren't mine, but the windowsill still had the scratch I'd made with a pocket knife during a teenage fight with Marianne. I remember yelling that I'd leave and never come back. She told me I'd crawl back the minute things got hard. I ran away, for real, 2 years later, with a suitcase, a scholarship, and a middle finger held high. I didn't come back until Grandpa died. Even then, I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of the bed, now snow globe still in my hand, and let my fingers drift across the old vanity drawer. It slid open easier than I remembered. Inside, a folded photo of me and Grandpa at the lake. I couldn't have been more than 9. He had his arm around me, and we were both laughing at something outside the frame. I stared at our faces, trying to remember that exact moment, but it had already dissolved into the fog of all the other days we didn't know were important. That photo had no date, just 2 inked numbers scribbled on the back, Hotel 875, a birthday, an anniversary, my breath caught, a safe code. It was the kind of thing he'd do, leave a clue not too obvious, but not hidden either. I pocketed the photo. On the way out of the room, I paused at the doorway, looked back once. This used to be the place I ran to when everything outside went wrong. Now it felt like another guest room, somewhere between forgotten and staged, the kind of space you tour but don't sleep in. I needed air. I slipped on a jacket and stepped out onto the back porch. The sky was that soft grey that never commits to rain, the kind of morning that keeps its distance. I stood there a while until I heard the shuffle of slippers on gravel. Claire Dwyer, as I live and breathe. I turned. Mrs. Madge. She lived 2 houses down, same as always. Her robe was mismatched with polka dot socks, and she carried a chip mug that read, "World's okayest grandma." I hadn't seen her in years, but she looked exactly the same, half wild, half wisdom all time in. "Didn't think I'd see your face back on this porch," she said. "Thought you'd burn that bridge clean." "Apparently not clean enough," I said. She sipped her coffee, squinting. "You look like your grandfather when he was keeping secrets. Got that tight mouth and stormy eyes." "What are you hiding, girl?" I didn't answer. Just stared out at the garden. The dirt was freshly turned. "You remember that safe?" she asked casually, like we were discussing the weather. "Behind the old bookshelf, the one that squeaks." I turned to her. "You know about that?" "Please," she scoffed. "Your grandfather showed me everything once. Said, 'Madge, if I croak, before the girls come home, you make sure they find what matters.'" I tried to mask the jolt in my chest. "Did he tell you the code?" She shook her head but smiled. "Didn't have to. That safe never changed its code. He said if they remember, they're meant to have it." Her eyes softened. "You were always the one who noticed things. Marianne, she sees angles. You see meaning." Then she turned and walked away, like she hadn't just handed me a key. I stood there a few minutes longer, letting her words settle into the quiet. A part of me still didn't believe anything would come of this, that maybe I'd open that safe and find dusty papers and expired warranties. But another part, the part that heard Grandpa's voice in quiet places, that part was already halfway up the stairs. The hallway outside Grandpa's old study still smelled like cedar and tobacco, a scent so tied to him it felt like stepping into a preserved moment. I paused at the door, letting my fingers trace the worn brass doorknob before pushing it open. The room greeted me in silence, heavy with dust and the kind of stillness that made you lower your voice without realizing. It hadn't been touched much, maybe dusted by Mum once in a while, but the furniture arrangement was exactly how he'd left it. Books stacked unevenly, a globe stuck on South America, a chair with the imprint of long afternoons. The bookshelf in the corner groaned when I pressed my hand against it. The left side caught on something just like it used to, but I remembered how to shift my weight to the right and nudge it open. The small panel behind was still there, slightly warped with age, its grain lighter than the rest of the wood. I knelt down. The safe was the size of a microwave matte grey, with a mechanical dial and a small tarnished handle. My fingers hesitated over the numbers. I closed my eyes. 120875. Slowly, deliberately, I turned the dial. Left, right, left, the way he taught me. The clicks felt heavier than I remembered. I reached for the handle and pulled. Nothing. Locked. I tried again, certain I hadn't fumbled the order. Still locked. My breath caught more in disappointment than surprise. I sat back on my heels and stared at the dial, the brass numbers dulled from age. Then I noticed the dust. It was subtle, but it had been disturbed. Not by my hand, this pattern was older. A clean semicircle just below the dial, like someone's palm had rested there recently. Too recently. I stood up slowly, heart tightening. Someone had tried to open it. Someone other than me. Marianne Dad, someone who knew it was here and had reason to care. I scanned the room again. Nothing looked out of place at first, but now everything felt suspicious. I moved to the desk, opening drawers, running my fingers along the inside lining, like I'd seen Grandpa do when looking for something important. In the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of faded utility bills, I found a photograph. Not framed, just loose, tucked into a manila folder. It was old, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. Grandpa and me again, this time I was maybe 5, sitting on his lap in front of the same safe. He had that grin he only saved for me, the kind that wrinkled the corners of his eyes. On the back of the photo, in familiar slanted ink, 17976, I turned the numbers over in my mind. November 12th, 1976. A date, a birthday, an anniversary. Maybe the combination had changed after all. I walked back to the safe, wiped my hands on my jeans, and entered the new sequence. Left to 11, right to 12, left to 76. The dial clicked like it wanted to give. I pulled the handle, still locked. I sat back on the floor, lips pressed into a tight line. Either the safe was broken or I was chasing ghosts. But something didn't feel random about it. 2 photos, 2 sets of numbers, 2 dates, both connected to Grandpa and me, both written in his handwriting. Why leave false clues unless I wasn't the only one meant to see them? I leaned back against the bookshelf, staring at the ceiling, the patterns of the wood, the soft shift of light as clouds passed by the window. A thought came uninvited. What if someone else had already opened the safe? What if what was meant for me had already been taken? The idea settled in my stomach like spoiled food. I ran a finger along the edge of the dial again, feeling the faint oil left by other hands. It wasn't just dust, it was smudged. Someone else had touched this. Not months ago. Recently. Which meant someone else had known about the safe, about what might be inside, and they'd either failed to open it, or they had succeeded and wanted me to believe they hadn't. The difference mattered more than I was ready to admit. I took both photos with me, along with the folder they were hidden in. Before leaving the room, I looked once more at the desk chair, slightly pulled back, as if someone had just risen from it. The room didn't feel like mine, but it didn't feel like his anymore either. It felt emptied, like someone had borrowed its secrets and returned the shell. I closed the door behind me gently. Locked or not, that safe was no longer just an object. It was a line someone had already crossed. I needed to know who and why. I started in the most obvious place, Marianne's desk. She kept a small home office in the converted sunroom, tucked behind a sliding door that didn't quite close all the way. It was filled with shelves of labelled binders, printouts, and colour-coded sticky notes, everything precisely in its place, the way she liked it. I waited until she left to pick up the kids from school. Mum was napping upstairs, Dad gone for his usual afternoon errands. I moved quickly, heart thudding in a steady, metronomic beat. The desk drawers were locked, but the filing cabinet wasn't. I sifted through insurance forms, school enrolment papers, tax records, then wedged between 2 folders marked house repairs and medical. I found an envelope labelled Heller and Morse. The name rang a bell. Local law firm downtown. Inside were itemised invoices, 3 dated over the last year and a half, all addressed to Marianne Dwyer. The services listed were vague consultation document prep filing fees, but the amounts weren't small, and the firm wasn't cheap. What stood out most was the header on one invoice, Estate Transition Services. I read it twice, my fingers tightening around the paper. There was no estate to transition. Grandpa had passed 3 years ago. The house had remained in our family's name, or so I thought. I took photos of everything with my phone, then carefully slid the papers back into place. My pulse hadn't slowed by the time I got to City Hall the next morning. The building smelled like old carpet and bureaucracy. A woman with tired eyes sat behind the records desk, sipping something that looked like day-old coffee. I gave her my name, the address of the house, and tried to keep my voice level. "I'm doing some property history research," I said. "For family archive purposes." She nodded without looking up. "Give me a second." A few keystrokes later, she printed a few sheets and slid them under the plexiglass divider. Latest deed and transaction record. "You'll want this too." She handed me a summary of the title history. I thanked her, stepped out into the lobby, and sat on one of the hard plastic chairs. I didn't even wait to get home. Right there, under the stale fluorescent light, I read line by line. The property had been transferred from our grandfather's estate into the joint ownership of Marianne and my mother 9 months ago. No mention of me, no language about co-inheritance, just 2 names, 1 signature date. My mother's? It was dated 3 weeks after her hospital stay. The one where she'd been on sedatives following her second procedure. I remembered that time vividly. Mum barely spoke in full sentences, slept for most of the day, could barely hold a fork. And somehow, she had been well enough to sign legal documents to approve a title transfer on a house with emotional and financial value. I flipped the page. There was her signature, small and shaky, nothing like the one I'd seen on school slips growing up. I stared at it for a long time, feeling something heavy settle behind my ribs. This wasn't negligence, this was calculated. Quiet, yes, but methodical. Someone had planned this, prepared it, executed it while everyone else was distracted by recovery, by grief, by the natural assumption that family meant fairness. Marianne didn't just want control, she wanted the paperwork to back it up. I drove home in silence, the papers folded in my bag like they were burning through the fabric. It wasn't just that they'd done it behind my back, it was that they hadn't even thought they needed to tell me. That was the worst part. The erasure wasn't violent, it was tidy, neat, the way you remove a book from a shelf and straighten the remaining one so no one notices the gap. When I got back, I walked straight upstairs, bypassing the kitchen, where I could hear Mom humming softly to herself, probably cooking something to make up for last night's tension. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I returned to my room, opened my laptop and began researching Heller and Morse, their specialty estate litigation and quiet transfers. Of course. I stared at the screen for a long time. The folder from Marianne's drawer still burned in my pocket. And somewhere in this house, a safe waited to be opened, not just for me, but maybe because someone knew what it would undo. Someone who had already crossed a line and made sure I was the last to know. I wasn't just going to sit with that knowledge. Not this time. I was going to use it. I found her in the kitchen humming softly, peeling carrots like she didn't have a clue what was unravelling. The sun spilled through the window in soft lines, catching the edge of her silver hair. For a moment, I watched her, wondering if I was wrong. Maybe she really didn't know. Maybe she just signed what Marianne put in front of her, too tired to read. Maybe this was all just a series of small oversights that snowballed into something cruel. But then I remembered the signature, that shaky scrawl, the hospital dates, and the quiet, practiced way this house had learned to forget me. I stepped into the room, and she looked up startled. "Oh," she said, smiling faintly. "Didn't hear you come in? You hungry? There's still some of that lentil soup I went to City Hall," I said flatly. The knife paused. She blinked. "Why, property records, title transfers." I watched her face carefully. Not surprise, not fear, just retreat, a slow withdrawal behind a polite expression. "Claire, honey, I don't know anything about that. Marianne handles the 'you signed it,'" I cut in. 9 months ago, right after your second stay in the hospital. Your signature is on the deed. You transferred the house to you and Marianne. Not me, just the 2 of you. She looked down at the cutting board. "I don't remember doing that." "Exactly." My voice didn't rise, but I could feel the cold edge creeping in. "You don't remember? Because you weren't in a state to be signing anything." Then maybe it was just for tax reasons, she offered weakly. You know how Marianne is. She always finds these efficiency things. This isn't a spreadsheet, I snapped. It's a house. It's Grandpa's house. He meant for it to be shared, or at least discussed. But no one said anything. No one told me. She picked up the peeler again, but her hand shook slightly. The carrot slipped from her grip and rolled off the counter. She didn't pick it up. "Don't make me pick sides, Claire," she said softly. That sentence didn't hit me like a slap. It hit like a sigh, like the slow deflation of hope. "You already did," I said quieter than I meant. "You just didn't say it out loud." She didn't answer, just stared at the spot where the carrot had landed. Her lips trembled like she might say something. More might reach for me, might explain, but she didn't. And I knew that silence. It wasn't indecision, it was survival. Mum had always chosen peace over truth, comfort over clarity. She stayed married to a man who stopped talking years ago. She forgave Marianne 1,000 small cruelties because they came wrapped in achievements and polite smiles. She let the house become a museum to disappointment and me a ghost in my own story. I walked out. I didn't slam the door, didn't yell. That wasn't how we did things here. We punished each other with distance. I stepped outside into the early drizzle, not bothering with a coat. The rain was thin and cold and honest. It soaked through my sleeves in minutes, but I didn't care. I needed the sting. I needed to feel something sharper than that kitchen. On the porch, Dad stood under the overhang smoking. He didn't acknowledge me, but I saw the twitch in his jaw when I stepped out. He used to smoke behind the shed when I was a kid, said it helped him think. Now he did it right out in the open, like he'd given up pretending. I stood next to him for a beat. The rain made tiny ticking sounds on the gutter above us. I waited for him to say something. Anything. He didn't. Just stared out at the yard like the grass had something important to tell him. "You knew too, didn't you?" I asked. He took a drag. Didn't look at me. "You watched her sign it. Or maybe you helped. Either way, you let it happen." He exhaled smoke, and with it silence. "Why?" I pressed. "Why didn't you say anything?" He flicked the ash off the end of his cigarette, still not looking at me. "Not my place to meddle in the girl's things," he said finally. My laugh was dry. "It was your father's house, your daughter's inheritance. But yeah, let's call it not meddling." He shrugged, like we were talking about weather again. I stepped off the porch down into the wet grass. The rain soaked through my shoes instantly. It reminded me of being 17, storming out of the house after a fight with Marianne barefoot, and furious, convinced I could run fast enough to become someone else. I hadn't. I'd just grown up into someone who still needed this place to love her even when it never would. I walked toward the shed, not to go inside, but to be far enough away that I couldn't hear my mother's careful chopping or my father's silent smoke or the emptiness of that kitchen. Behind me, the house stood still. No one came after me. They never had. The grass beneath my feet was soft with rain, each step soaking deeper into my shoes until I couldn't tell if it was the weather or the weight of everything pressing down. I stood behind the shed near the edge of the property line where the trees grew thicker and the house couldn't quite see me anymore. That's when I heard the voice. "You look just like him standing there." I turned. Mrs. Madge stood a few feet away, a wide umbrella in one hand and something pressed to her chest with the other. Her rain boots were floral and a little too large for her frame. She looked like a painting that hadn't fully dried. I didn't respond, unsure if I had the energy for conversation. but she stepped closer, squinting at me through the mist. "He used to come out here too," she said the air was clearer at the edge. I gave her a tired smile. He wasn't wrong. She nodded, then held out the object in her hand. It was an envelope, yellowed and slightly warped, the seal brittle but intact. My name was written across it in Grandpa's handwriting. "He left it with me," she said simply. "Said I'd know when to give it to you." I hesitated. "Why now?" She smiled, but there was no humour in it. "Because you came back. Not just with your body, but with your questions. He always said if Claire comes home angry, give her space. But if she comes home quiet, give her the truth." I took the envelope carefully, my fingers shaking more than I wanted them to. The seal cracked slightly as I broke it open. Inside was a folded letter, thick paper that smelled like cedar and dust. His handwriting filled the page, neat and certain. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back. Maybe not for long, maybe not for good. But you came, and that matters more than you know." I left things unfinished, not because I didn't love you enough, but because I trusted you'd know when to look. Inside the safe is a version of this house no one else has seen. But in case they got to it before you, here's what matters. I left the house to you. Not to divide, not to sell, but to protect. You understood it better than anyone. You saw its heart. I kept a copy of the will with my lawyer, and another where I thought only you would find it. If you haven't yet, keep looking. They may have taken the paper, but they can't take what I meant. Love you always, kiddo. Grandpa. Behind the letter was another folded sheet. This one thinner older, with a notarized seal at the bottom. His original will, dated 2 years before he passed. It listed my name and only mine next to the property title. The house at 14 Holly Ridge Lane shall be inherited solely by my granddaughter Claire Dwyer, for reasons I do not owe the world, but ones I know in my bones. I read that line 3 times. My knees bent without meaning to, and I sat in the wet grass. The envelope still in my lap, the truth in my hands. He had chosen me. Quietly, without spectacle, he had known what this place needed, and who would protect it. Madge sat down next to me, no hesitation, no concern about the wet ground. He didn't trust Marianne with it, she said. Too sharp, too interested in what things are worth instead of what they mean. I nodded, unable to speak. And your mum? Well, he loved her, but he knew she wouldn't fight for it, not against her own comfort. I folded the papers carefully, tucking them back into the envelope like they were holy. Why didn't he just tell me? She sighed. Because he knew the house would turn into a battlefield, and he didn't want you to bleed for it until you were ready to win. I sat there a long time listening to the rain shift from drizzle to silence. The house behind me still hadn't noticed I was gone. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to beg it to. I had something better now, proof, not just of ownership, but of intent. Grandpa had believed in me when no one else did, and he trusted me with more than property. He trusted me with the truth. That night, I sat on the floor of the guest room, still Marianne's so-called temporary quarters, with my legs crossed and my laptop open beside me. I pulled out an old journal I'd found stuffed inside one of the moving boxes I never unpacked. It smelled faintly of ink and old perfume, the pages warped at the corners. I hadn't written in it in years, but the words were still mine. Scratched in a hurry, dated with bitter precision. I flipped through half-skimming entries like they belonged to someone else. One line jumped out, I'm either too much or not enough, but never just right for anyone in this house. I traced over it with my finger, remembering how I'd written it the day Marianne had screamed at me for ruining her birthday dinner, because I showed up late after taking 2 buses across town in the rain just to be there. I'd held the gift in my lap the entire ride, then handed it to her with shaking hands, only to be met with an eye roll and the words, "Why even bother if you can't be on time?" That night, I wrote the sentence 3 times in a row. Too much, not enough. Never just right. That theme followed me out of the house into college, into the arms of a man who liked the idea of me more than the reality. He once told me while reading one of my stories, "You write like someone's always watching." I remember blinking at him confused. He meant it as a critique, but it felt like an accusation. And maybe he wasn't wrong. Maybe growing up in a house where every word was measured and every silence was louder than an argument had taught me to perform, to anticipate, to guard. That man left after 6 months, said I exhausted him, said being with me was like reading a book you knew wouldn't end well. He said it kindly, like he was doing me a favour, but the echo of his words stayed longer than he did. That's when I stopped writing in journals. Now, holding this one again, I felt the old tension creep back into my shoulders, the urge to fold myself small. But I didn't close it. I didn't hide from it. I kept reading. And when I finished, I opened my laptop and created a folder called The Other Side of the Story. Then I took the recorder from my bag, one I'd used during interviews for a writing job years ago, and checked the battery. Still good. I didn't want revenge. Not exactly. I wanted clarity. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted them to hear themselves. The next day, when Marianne left to run errands, I walked into her room with quiet, deliberate steps. Her door was unlocked, her space pristine as always. Colour-coordinated closet desk, neatly arranged makeup brushes, lined like tools. I looked for a place the recorder would pick up sound, but stay hidden. The bookshelf had a row of faux leather-bound classics, clearly for decoration. I slid one out, made room behind it, and tucked the recorder inside. Then I replaced the book. I stepped back and looked around, pulse steady. I didn't feel like a spy. I felt like someone collecting receipts. For once, I wanted to stop wondering if I was imagining things, if I'd misread the silence, if my intuition was just sensitivity. I wanted something solid. Words I could hold. Something that could prove, maybe to them, maybe to me, that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the problem. As I stepped out of the room, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I didn't look angry. I looked tired, but behind the fatigue was something steadier. Resolve. The house had tried to shrink me, but I was done making myself small to fit inside its rooms. That night, when the house was still, and the only sound was the slow tick of the hallway clock, I slipped the recorder from behind Marianne's bookshelf. My hands didn't tremble, not yet. I waited until I was back in the guest room. Door, locked headphones, plugged-in laptop open. I hit play. The first few seconds were muffled footsteps, the rustle of fabric. Then Marianne's voice sharp and clear. "You can't keep avoiding it." "Mum," she signed it. "It's done." There was a pause, and then my mother's voice softer, hesitant. "I didn't know what I was signing, Marianne. I thought it was just medical." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Marianne again, colder this time. "You knew what it meant. Claire has no place here anymore. You said it yourself. She always brings trouble." My fist clenched around the base of the laptop. The file kept playing another few minutes of back and forth. My mother's voice growing smaller, Marianne's growing sharper. She used words like stability, clean break, and we can't let her derail everything again. I listened to all of it. Twice. By the end, my jaw ached from how tightly I'd been clenching it. So it was true. Not just the signatures, not just the silence. The erasure had been said out loud, chosen, planned. They hadn't just forgotten me. They'd pushed me out and locked the door. I stared at the waveform on my screen, heart pounding but steady. I saved the file under the folder I'd made, the other side of the story, and then I opened a new email. I sent it to Noah. We weren't close anymore, but once in college, he'd been the one person who saw me clearly. He'd gone into law, last I heard family estate stuff. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he'd answer. I just didn't expect it to be in under 15 minutes. My phone buzzed with a text. Just listened. That's heavy. Call me. I did. Claire, he said, voice low, this is bad. What they did. If your mum really wasn't competent when she signed those papers, and there's proof. This recording, your grandfather's will, he paused. You might have a case. A strong one. Even if the deed's already transferred. Especially then, he said, fraud doesn't expire. And this isn't just a legal issue, it's personal. They conspired to cut you out. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, one leg pulled up to my chest forehead, resting on my knee. You okay? He asked after a beat. Not really, I said. But I think I know what I'm going to do next. Good, he said, because they're counting on you to stay quiet. I ended the call and sat there a while longer, staring at the glow of the screen. On it, my name, the audio file, the folder, proof. For the first time since I came back, I didn't feel like I was unravelling. I felt like I was building something. I didn't know what it would look like when it was done, but it would have my name on it, my voice in it, my truth at the centre. The next morning, I didn't wait for the house to empty. I moved before coffee, before anyone else stirred, like the weight of what I knew wouldn't let me rest another minute. I walked straight to Grandpa's study, shut the door softly behind me, and knelt in front of the safe. The numbers I tried before birthdays, anniversaries, the ones scrawled on old photographs, had failed. But I'd overlooked one date, not because I'd forgotten it, but because I hadn't wanted to think about it. Grandma's death, the day that unravelled everything soft in this house. She was the one who used to smooth tension with gentle hands, who made sure no one was ever left out, who once told me in a whisper that she saw me even when it felt like no one else did. I closed my eyes. December 14th, 2014. I turned the dial slowly. 12, 14, 14. The lock clicked. Not the hesitant, almost sound from before, but a full, firm release. I froze, breath-caught fingers trembling. Then I pulled the handle and opened the door. Inside the space was smaller than I remembered, but every inch was used. On top sat a thick-sealed envelope marked in Grandpa's handwriting, Claire. For when you're ready. Beneath it a smaller envelope yellowing at the edges. I lifted it carefully, opened it and slid out a single photograph. Me, age 6, in overalls and muddy boots, standing next to Grandpa in the garden. My smile was missing teeth. His hand rested protectively on my shoulder. Written on the back again in his familiar scrawl, she always knew where the roots were. I set the photo aside, chest tightening. Beneath it was a folded document, crisp and clearly official. I opened it to see the same will I'd seen in the envelope from Mrs. Madge, handwritten, notarized, naming me the sole heir. But this version was signed with bold certainty, undeniable, uncontested. I placed it beside the photo and turned back to the sealed letter. The flap gave way with a soft tear. Inside a single page. Claire. If you're reading this, then you came back at the right time. I always knew you would. You have your grandmother's timing. She used to say, don't chase the train. Wait for the station. You've waited long enough. This house doesn't belong to whoever gets here first. It belongs to the one who understands what it holds. That's you. You saw what others missed. You heard what others ignored. You asked questions even when it was easier to stay silent. I left things this way not to confuse you, but to protect what mattered. If I'd put your name in neon, someone would have found a way to strip it down. But hidden. Hidden, it could wait for you. And you found it. Take your time. Take your space. But don't give it away again. You earned it long before I put it on paper. With pride, Grandpa. I read it 3 times. Then, once more, aloud, barely whispering. The room didn't change. The house didn't shift. But something in me did. I gathered the contents carefully, placing them into a folder I brought with me. I stood, slowly knees stiff, and turned to look at the room as a whole. This place had always felt like a vault of other people's decisions. Now, it held mine. I didn't know what came next, but I knew where I stood, on ground that remembered me, with proof that someone had always seen me, not as too much or not enough, but exactly right. I stepped out of the study and closed the door behind me. This time, I didn't do it gently. I spent the afternoon cooking, not because I owed anyone dinner, but because I wanted control over the table this time. It felt important, symbolic maybe. I roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon mashed the potatoes just the way Mum liked to even bake the cornbread that only Grandma used to make. The kitchen filled with smells of something warm and familiar, but I moved through it with a kind of calm precision like setting a stage. By 6, the table was set, the wine poured, and everyone had taken their seats. Marianne arrived last surprised, then suspicious. "This is, nice," she said, slow and wary, like the word might be bait. "Didn't expect you to cook on your last night." Mom smiled faintly, folding her napkin. "I'm glad you're leaving on good terms," she added. Dad didn't say anything. He never did. I took my seat, slowly smoothing the edges of my placemat. "Actually, I said there's something I wanted to say before we eat." They looked up. Marianne cocked her head. "This feels ominous," she muttered. I reached into my bag and pulled out the recorder. Pressed play. Marianne's voice filled the room. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. She signed it. "Claire has no place here anymore." Mum froze hand midair. Dad blinked slowly, but his eyes didn't move. I let the recording run for another minute, just long enough for the tone to settle into everyone's bones. Then I clicked it off. Silence settled like dust. "Where did you, Marianne, started, but I cut her off. Doesn't matter. What matters is what you said, and what Mum didn't stop." I turned to her. "You knew. Even if you don't remember signing the papers, you knew what it meant. You let her make me into a guest in my own family." Mum's lip trembled, but she didn't speak. I reached into my folder and pulled out the will. The original, handwritten one. I unfolded it, carefully laid it flat on the table and slid it forward so all of them could read. Marianne leaned in. Her face tightened. "Where did you get this?" "From Grandpa," I said. "Where he left it? For me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. "This isn't legal," I said. "It is, fully notarized. Dated before the one you manipulated." Dad still hadn't looked up. "There's more," I said, and now my voice was steady. Not angry, just clear. I pulled out one final envelope. Sealed. The writing on the front, unmistakable Grandpa's. I slid it toward Dad. "He left this for you. Said to give it to me when I returned." Did he ever mention that Dad stared at the envelope? Didn't touch it. "You had it this whole time," I said quietly. You knew. Mum turned to him, slow blinking like she'd missed a step in her own life. Arthur. He didn't move. Marianne hissed. Is this a joke? Why would she have something like that? I answered for him. Because Grandpa didn't trust any of you to do the right thing. So he put it in the hands of the one person who always did what she said she would, even if no one noticed. I broke the seal myself and pulled out the letter. Cleared my throat. Arthur. I read aloud, if she returns and you've done nothing by then, give her this. She is the keeper of this house. I trusted you to remember that. You owe her that much. The words hung in the air like smoke. Marianne stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? After years of disappearing, I looked at her evenly. I didn't disappear. You just got louder. Her mouth opened again, but she had nothing to say. Dad reached for his wine. Took a sip. He told me, he said finally. Before the end, he said the house was for you. That it always was. But I didn't want the fight. I figured it'd sort itself out. You let her erase me, I said, voice low, and you called it staying neutral. No one moved. The food on the table had gone cold. The kitchen light hummed. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like exile. It felt like power. Mine. I'm not leaving, I said finally. Not in 72 hours. Not ever unless I choose to. And if any of you want to challenge that, you'll need more than fake signatures and half-truths. I stood slowly, gathered the letter, the will, the recorder. Marianne's face had gone pale. Mum just looked tired. Dad watched me with something almost like regret. I didn't care. I had said what needed to be said. The house was no longer a place I had to earn. It was mine. Because someone had seen me. And now I saw myself too. After the dinner, that long, silent, truth-soaked dinner, I stepped outside. The night had cooled and the porch light flickered softly, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay on. I stood for a while near the railing, hands in my pockets, listening to the sounds of the house recalibrating behind me. Eventually, I heard the soft creak of the door. Dad joined me without a word, cigarette in hand. He didn't offer one. He never did. He leaned against the post, exhaled smoke into the darkness. For a while, we just stood like that two people who had finally run out of places to hide. You remind me of the part of me I never let live, he said suddenly. His voice was low, almost apologetic. The part that wanted to push back. The part that didn't just follow what was easy. I didn't answer right away. The breeze carried the smoke sideways. Then, why did you bury that part so deep? He shrugged. Same reason everyone does. It's safer, easier to be agreeable, to nod and wait it out. That's what my father did. That's what I thought made a good man. I looked at him, then really looked. He seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence, like he'd spent his whole life shrinking to fit the shape others needed. You watched it happen, I said. You let Marianne twist things. You let Mom drift into her silence. You let me get erased. I know, his voice cracked slightly. I told myself I was staying out of it, but really, I was staying safe. I didn't want to feel for him not after all this, but something in his voice, how tired it sounded, how unguarded, pulled at the edges of my anger. If I forgive you, I said, not looking at him, does that make me like you? He was quiet for a long time. I could feel the question settle between us like a weight. Finally, he said, maybe. Or maybe it means you're stronger than I ever was. I laughed, not kindly. That's a nice thought, Dad. But I don't think strength is the same as carrying other people's guilt. Maybe not, he admitted, but holding on to that anger, it'll keep you warm for a while. Then, it'll burn you. I turned to him. You sound like someone who let it burn too long. I did, he said, and now I see you doing what I couldn't. Standing up, saying things out loud. Your grandfather saw it. I see it now, too. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the trees. I leaned forward against the railing. I don't need your approval, I said. Not anymore. I know, he said, but I needed to give it. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. But for the first time, his presence didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like something old breaking apart, like rust shaking loose. We stood there a while longer, just breathing the same air under the same light in the house that for once felt like mine. Marianne left 2 days later. No dramatic goodbye, no shouting match or bitter send-off. Just the sound of wheels dragging across the gravel drive and the hollow slam of a trunk. I watched her car disappear down the street from the upstairs window, arms crossed over my chest, wondering what she'd tell herself about all this. That I'd tricked her, that I was ungrateful, or maybe she wouldn't tell herself anything. Just move on the way she always did, her version of events neat, unchallenged. Mum didn't say much after that. She moved through the house like a ghost, a little more faded than before, always one room behind me. I left her be. Some silences weren't worth breaking anymore. Dad didn't text. I hadn't expected him to. He was the kind of man who thought closure was what happened when the conversation ended, not when anything was resolved. That was fine. I didn't need his words. I needed space. And I had it now. The house was quiet in a different way. Not empty, just still. I started working on small things. I didn't rip anything out or repaint walls. I wasn't here to modernize. I was here to remember, to return the house to itself. I fixed the loose kitchen drawer, rehung the screen door that always stuck. I washed the curtains by hand the way Grandma used to, and let them dry in the wind just to bring that scent back into the rooms. I moved slowly, deliberately. Some days I did nothing but sit on the porch and reread Grandpa's letter. Other days I worked until sunset barefoot, and dusty elbows deep in earth or paper or memory. I found the journal by accident. It was tucked behind the old dresser in Grandma's room, leather-bound, and faded, the corners frayed from years of handling. I didn't recognise it at first. It wasn't labelled, didn't scream for attention, just sat quietly waiting. When I opened it, her handwriting reached out like a whisper. The pages were filled with entries, short thoughts, recipes, weather observations, but interwoven among them were portraits, not drawn but written, each entry focused on a family member. One page for Dad, a paragraph for Marianne, a few lines for Mom, and then pages for me, stories I didn't remember, descriptions of things I'd said as a child, the way I'd folded towels to match hers, how I used to sit at her feet during phone calls and mimic her expressions. Notes on how I always asked why, even when it made people uncomfortable. She wrote, "Claire is the thread that never breaks. Even when stretched, frayed, tangled, she holds." I ran my fingers over that line again and again, the ink slightly faded, but the meaning still bright. She'd seen me. Not just in the ways I wanted to be seen, but in the ways I didn't know I needed. The difficult parts, the restless ones, the quiet defiance that had always lived just under my skin. She hadn't just loved me, she'd understood me. I closed the journal and held it against my chest, sitting on the edge of the bed, where she used to hum lullabies out of tune. This house wasn't just mine because of legal papers or secret wills. It was mine because it remembered me. Because it held pieces of the people who had seen me fully, even when no one else did. I stayed there until the light changed, watching shadows shift across the floor. And for the first time since coming back, I felt still. That stillness stayed with me, but it didn't mean I stayed silent. A few weeks after Marianne left, I started something small, a reading circle just once a week in the living room with its creaky floorboards and faded rug. At first, it was just 2 women from the neighbourhood, Joan, who used to teach before the school closed, and Teresa, who ran the flower shop on Main. We drank tea from Grandma's mismatched cups and passed around poems or dog-eared pages from books we half remembered. We didn't talk much about the words at first. It was more about the breath between them, the quiet space where someone finally asked, "What did you think?" and waited for an answer. Then more women came. Mothers, teenagers, a retired librarian named Elsie who brought her own folding chair. The living room began to fill with voices that had never belonged there before. We didn't always read. Sometimes someone just needed to say something out loud. Sometimes the books were an excuse. I didn't mind. I didn't. One evening, during a warm spring dusk, a girl I hadn't seen before sat cross-legged on the rug by the window. Her name was Lily. Maybe 14. She hadn't said a word all night, just listened with eyes too old for her age. We were packing up when she stood suddenly and said, "I thought girls are supposed to stay quiet to keep the home." The room went still. I looked at her, this small girl, with a voice made of both apology and defiance. "Who told you that?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "Everyone." A few women nodded soft murmurs, rippling like they'd heard it too, maybe even said it once. I stepped closer, crouched, so we were eye to eye. "Sometimes," I said, "silence is how homes disappear." She didn't move, but her throat tightened. "You don't have to be loud," I added, "but you do have to be honest. And sometimes that's the hardest noise in a house." She looked down, fingers curled into the hem of her sweater. I reached out and handed her the journal Grandma had once used, a blank one I'd found in the drawer beside her bed. "Start here," I said. "Write what you don't want to say yet." That's how I began. She took it carefully, like it might crack in her hands. I didn't need her to thank me. The way she clutched the notebook was enough. After they all left, I sat on the porch steps, watching dusk settle into the trees. The sky above the house was lavender and soft, the way it used to look when I was small, and still believed my voice would echo through these walls if I just spoke loud enough. I didn't need echoes anymore. I had ears, and the girls who used to be quiet, they were finally starting to speak. The manuscript took me 6 weeks to finish. I wrote in the mornings when the house was quiet and the air still smelled like old wood and sleep. I wrote on the porch, on the floor of my childhood room, at the kitchen table where Mom used to tap her nails while waiting for the kettle. It wasn't a memoir, not exactly. It was a story about a girl who returned home thinking she was there to say goodbye, only to realise she'd come back to claim something deeper than a house. I didn't give her my name, but she had my questions, my silence, my fire. Writing it didn't fix everything, but it made the weight feel like something I could carry without hunching. The day I typed the last sentence, I left the document open and just stared at the blinking cursor. I didn't cry, I didn't smile. I just felt full, like every part of me had finally arrived at the same place. That afternoon, while I was folding laundry, I got an email from Marianne. The subject line was blank, the message was short. I still think the house was mine, but I never knew how to tell a story. That was all. No apology, no defense. But it wasn't nothing. It was more than I ever thought she'd send. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything left to say. I printed the email and folded it twice. That night, I returned to Grandpa's study. The safe opened easily now, like it recognised me. Inside, I'd left it mostly empty. Just the will, his letter, my photograph as a child. I placed Marianne's email on top and paused for a moment. Not to forgive, not to forget, but to file it away, to let it live in a place that no longer had power over me. Then I added one more thing. A fresh envelope. Inside, the first printed pages of my manuscript. The title page read, "Inheritance, a story no one asked for." Below it, in smaller letters by the girl who stayed. I locked the safe and stood. The air felt clean, undisturbed, the kind of quiet that didn't ask anything of me. I went upstairs, sat at my desk and opened a new file. A new chapter. A blank page. I typed the first sentence slowly, letting it land in the room like a quiet vow. I didn't claim the house. I claimed the memory I no longer apologised for. I leaned back, listening to the creak of the chair, the hum of summer through the screen window, and the echo of my own voice in my head, not loud, not sharp. Just true. Finally true.